Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right. Well, co-written with past guest Ariel Gordon, but we're not going to let her talk this time. GMB Chomichuk, Blood Letters, out now through Great Plains Publications. Gregory, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
So as I mentioned, this is a collaborative book between yourself and Ariel, and it kind of started about a decade ago?
Yeah, that's right. It somewhere in and around 2015, we started sending strange letters to one another, Ariel and I, about this sort of hellish future landscape where a war had broken out, and we didn't know the details of those things. We figured them out by sending letters back and forth to each other.
So whose letter was first?
Apocryphally, I always give Ariel credit, and sometimes she gives me credit. We can't quite remember. All we know is that eventually we settled on each of us having a character in the story that we would sort of lead the discussion with, and then we shared one character between us that allowed us to have a sort of hybrid, chimeric point of view on one of the aspects of the technology in our world.
And is that something you sorted out by doing it, or like did you discuss the kind of parameters of how you would do things ahead of time?
Yeah, to borrow from better, more well-known artist, Leonardo da Vinci always said, movement gives shape to form. And we basically undertook the process of writing the story before we discussed what the story's shape, themes, motivations, what any of those things would be. And our curiosity, the same way if you have ever written letters, like physical letters to and from somebody, your own curiosity prompts you to follow up on a statement, a phrase, an idea, a turn of phrase that they've used for clarification. And letters are such a different form of communication than we're used to in this modern age. It was a really fun way to turn the switch of anachronism to a time when you had to send transmissions in a burst, but we also set it in the future at the time when you would assume you wouldn't need to do that kind of stuff.
Right, but then you obviously create circumstances in which it's necessary for that.
Yeah, like for example, if I have a character, if my character says, the war has already started and we have been pushed from the front lines to, some location, then Ariel might say, oh, we heard from somebody else about that place through a different letter, which then prompts me to take her detail, add it to my idea, and then respond through the voice of the character. It was a very interesting way to craft a novel, very different than how I usually work.
It sounds like more like the yes and improvisatory like method, like, oh yes and this.
Yeah. Occasionally we would communicate outside of the letters themselves, and as we got closer to publication, as the book had to go through its inevitable editing process, then we would obviously communicate more directly about what was meant by this and how do we shape it. But less like improv where you say yes and in order to keep the story moving in a logic that the audience can follow. It was more, in my case, I would try to add plot elements and Ariel would add emotional elements. And then those two things became an engine that would drive. So I would try to create a scenario that would prompt an emotional response from Ariel, some horrible event, feature, encounter. And then she would respond to that. And then it would kind of bring out the pathos in my own character or in her character's voice. And they would then either console one another or encourage one another, or, as was often the case, simply change the subject because it was too horrible to keep talking about.
So kind of pushing at each other's buttons a little?
A little bit, yeah. I would say that's a good way to to characterize it. And then every now and then, Ariel would send me a very pleasantly rude comment by text message to say, no, we're not killing that character. That character's mine. I have plans for them.
Gotcha. So, as you said, you each kind of pick one character and then work together through another character. Was it always going to be siblings?
I don't know if it began consciously that way. And we started using the term cousin in the same way, that you just, with family members you see or like all the time, or friends of the family you see or like all the time. We started using cousin that way so that we wouldn't have to clarify it. The actual codified structure of who was related to who and who wasn't, we did as sort of a final editing pass. We had a rough idea at first, but family history, when you read somebody's family history in letters or collections of letters, very little time is spent explaining why people have the epithets they have. And so we tried to do very little of that, but then collect it in a little glossary at the end.
Did you read other people's letters in preparation for this at all? Or is this something like you've always read other people's like letters and had that in the back of your head as you're writing this?
Yeah, epistolary novels I absolutely adore. Stories that are told through letters and correspondence. And then also my grandfather was a great letter writer and a journal. He would write in his journals regularly. My mother also did the same thing. And so I read a lot of, as we came into shape the draft, once it finally felt like a book, Michael, things don't always feel like a book, but when it started to feel like a book, then I would go and I would try to immerse myself in that way of having a different voice.
Is that the grandfather you mentioned in the acknowledgments?
That is, yes.
Yeah. Did you draw from some of that at all?
Yeah, my grandfather and we had an interesting relationship because I was quite young. But I saw him first and knew him first as an artist and a painter, a pipe smoker who would teach me how to play chess and every now and then disappear into the basement to do these oil paintings. And it wasn't until I got a little bit older that he explained that his practice of making art started as a way of contending with his night terrors that were left over from his time as an airman in the RAF during World War II.
Is that why the poetry comes out as a coping mechanism, and like finding solace in wartime through art weaves its way into this book?
Well, both Ariel and I thought that one of the things that we could bring to the story that would be real honest is our tendency to be foragers. And I think all artists, whether they think so or not, I believe all artists are foragers in a way. And you just go into the world and you gather up whatever you need for nourishment, and that's what you're bringing back. And so sometimes, even in horrible places, you can gather up some nourishment. And so I know for me, visual art is a great method by which I understand better the world I see. Writing as well, but we leaned a little bit on our own personal strengths that neither of us shared. So Ariel is a poet and I can create visual work, and so she would forage in the way that poets do and I would forage in the way that visual artists do, and then we would both use our skills as novelists and essayists to craft the letter.
So are you making the art contemporaneously to those letters or missives within the book, or is that something that you're infilling after in that editing process where you're kind of shaping as a book at the point when you knew it was a book, like you said?
Well, whenever I'm working, which my family would be quick to point out is all the time, but I tend to be working on a lot of projects at once. And so one of the ways in which I shape it or keep it separate in my head is I keep notebooks and I scratch out images and visuals. Whether they will ever appear in the book or not is not the point. It's just my way of sort of, like I said, gathering that nourishment for the story. And so a lot of those images that appear in the book were from that process. Literally my artist's hands drawing images, which then we attribute to Albany's collection in the archive.
So with that in mind, are you sketching out kind of as something arises within the text, either your own or Ariel's, that kind of prompts like, oh, this is like these machines, what would they look like? That like, are you imagining that in conjunction with kind of the period in which you're creating it on text?
Well, in the interest of answering that fully for your dear listeners, I write for some illustrators, I illustrate for some writers, and I write and illustrate my own work. And so the idea of using visuals, words and pictures together is something that comes pretty naturally to me. Um, and it's just a question of how much of one ingredient you're going to mix in. And so in this story, sometimes the letters would prompt an image, and sometimes the image would prompt a letter. But for the most part, I was a little bit greedy in a way in that I didn't share those things with Ariel. We kept it just a correspondence of the letters until we started to design it as an archive, as a book. And that's when those images started to, I would share those with her. And then, so if anyone picks up Blood Letters, you'll notice there's a number of black and white line illustrations that have a very narrow, thin point, something that you could pick up with a ballpoint pen. The idea being that the character Albany could find a simple drawing implement anywhere, and he could draw this kind of line no matter where he was. The other illustrated elements that make up the archive are ones that I did in a very different style that kind of frame the archive, frame the world, frame the technology, transmissions, maps. I wanted that to have a different hand than Albany's, so it felt like his art was nested inside of this other more terrible world, and that Ariel's poems and my letters with her back and forth would also be nested inside this world.
So when you're creating some of these things, you're almost creating like a barrier between you as the creator, or at least like an intermediary who is the character as creator.
Yes, in a way that was for me when I write prose. It's often yeah, I can hide myself, the part of me that's me, really nicely inside of any exposition. But in a letter, the only way to have exposition is through the actual character's voice. And so the letter writing was an interesting, at least for me, an interesting obfuscation of that process of writing, where I had to be honest, I had to say things from a character's point of view, but also decide when that character was telling the truth and when they weren't, and then also try to give enough clues as a writer to the reader when that character is telling truth. All letters, I think, contain at their hearts an unreliable narrator. People always leave out things in letters, and so we had to, by choice, leave out very specific things or put in very specific things in order to make it a story and not just an archive of letters.
Is that something that comes about in the editing phase, or are you sussing that out as you're writing back and forth?
A little from column A, a little from column B. When we finally decided to make it a book, as we said, Ariel came over. We did that in person. We would just sit for long hours and decide. A big decision that we made was that the letters did not have to appear in our archive in chronological order in order to be an interesting story, that they could kind of appear in a emotional order in order for the story to have what a reader would recognize as the shape of a novel. You'd have this escalation towards a climax that is hidden from the reader until the last second.
Okay, that begs a question, because I noticed it while I was reading that, in paying attention kind of like the year 3, year 4 kind of dates. On page 77, there's a time jump to year 21.
That's right. Yeah.
And I was like, wait, did I like miss a page or like what happened? And then it slams you out of it and then throws you back into the like kind of sequential flow at a certain point. It sounds like that was a very intentional thing.
Very intentional, because what Ariel and I tried to do is we tried to say, okay, this isn't And again, it added one more layer to how we were separating ourselves from and nesting the work within the work within the work. The collection of letters from these characters have been collected by a character in the story to be passed on to another character in the story, who is in turn put them in an order so that their, spoiler alert, their absence at the end of the story makes sense to the next character who finds them, right? So it's organized the way you might put a playlist together in order to have the emotion move through your musical cues.
There's a fourth character, Kuznetsov. There's a couple missives that, you know, we have a different voice in the mix. Was that something that you realized initially that you needed that, or is that something that you know, in reflection you decided in terms of shaping this archive?
Yeah, we cut out. It's a good question, Mike. I really, which really underlines a careful reading of the book. So, number one, thank you, and number two, to answer your question, the number of characters that were in the earlier drafts were much greater. There were a lot more mentions. There were a lot more letters. There were a lot more scraps that we thought were kind of necessary. And then as we pared them down, it became partially an excavation. You're brushing away the parts you don't need just to reveal the important skeleton of the story. And so there were characters that didn't make the cut, so as it were. But some outside force is at work in these characters' lives, and that scientist, that doctor, is that representative of that world that is, making algorithms and running programs and figuring out protocols in order to hold the world that they understand together in order to fight this great conflict. And we were very careful not to, name sides or pick sides or even present the notion that one side was just or right in our conflict, because really, I don't think Ariel or I really believe in the concept of a just war. There's sort of just war.
Was that ever a discussion about, if we're going to tell a war story, that it not be in any way kind of glorifying things, but like present it bleakly and truly?
I think the part of Ariel and I that are friends didn't have to say that out loud. That was kind of a real wonderful part of the collaboration, is that as I would read the letters, I realized she wasn't going to, and I wasn't planning to, and so we weren't going to as we went along. And then at a certain point, we had to make there was maybe one or two direct references to one side or the other that we excised at the last, in some of the last drafts, to just say, yeah, no, we'll make that a conscious choice. It had been a conscious choice, but a few things had squeaked in through characters' voices, and we redacted those elements because that's not really the point. Who's right or wrong was not the point of these characters figuring out how to survive.
Speaking of redacting or excising things, how important is concision within kind of each individual letter? Like did you ever err on the side of, like, if they're in the war, they're not going to have a ton of time to, write about something, that like we need to make these brief out of like kind of the urgency of the situation in which these people would find themselves writing?
Yeah, I think we had this great MacGuffin, is that one of the characters was not present on the front lines, and so they had the luxury of introspection, the luxury of, and this was from Ariel's point of view. This is one of the things I really liked about the letters that she wrote, is from Millicent's point of view. Millie, in the story, she can take time to think and ponder and wonder and pose questions of the world she's in that the other characters didn't have. But then that also gave us the ability to have an escalation, a rhythm that lifted the stakes up. When we needed it, we could cut away from her and the letters would be short and a little bit more confusing and a little bit more terrifying and a little bit more maybe violent, or the imagery more horrible. But we could return to Millicent's more wise perspective on how the world was shaping around her. And I think we both decided that Millicent would be wise beyond her years, basically because of the amount of horror she had witnessed.
You mentioned the stakes. Obviously, one of the things that this book seems to be wrestling with is like humanity's, inhumanity, and that
Yeah.
you introduce these, I mean, for lack of a better term, robots that have a humanity. At one point there's a severed hand, and it turns out it belonged to another robot's partner. That like there's something that I don't like. Was that ever a conscious thing to like kind of explore? What makes a human and what makes a robot inhuman?
It was conscious in so much as this is a theme that appears over and over in the work that I'm doing. I think this, Michael, is something that if there was baggage I brought to the work, it was that. And I just think in this era that we are in, people are forgetting the notion of what it means to craft something in your own image and what the inevitable result of that will be. Because we are flawed. At our best, humans are flawed. And so even if we can make another artificial life, it will not be more flawed, or won't be perfect. It will be as flawed as we are. Just spend an hour talking with any teenager and ask yourself if their parents got everything right. Well, this is the best we can do when we love something. Now imagine if it's just a tool. There'll be so much ambivalence to how it's crafted. There'll be so little care in how it's handled, because you don't love it, And so we tried to create a world where some of the art and joy and wisdom that comes from seeing the world, as you are, not as it is, would also appear in those artificial creations. And they don't figure prominently in the story as far as our characters go, but they're part of the world they have to contend with. And we found it to be quite interesting. And it was, to me, that whole scene that you're talking about, this was a surprise. I would read those and it would unfold in letters from Ariel, how this character was dealing with their injuries in the war. And I was delighted to read these, so excited to find out what would happen next. And so you try to one up it on your side, like, oh, this interesting thing is happening to Ariel's character. I better come up with something as interesting on my side.
Speaking of tech, who came up with the bags? The notion of this, regenerative technology.
Yeah, that started with me for sure. I and then refined. I think it really evolved, bouncing back and forth between us. It started as just a plot element that if we're going to have a future conflict, maybe there should be some element of medical technology. Unfortunately, medicine and war evolve in tandem to one another, and at a pace with one another. And so one of the technologies in the story, for the dear listener's sake, are these tiny particle machines that form a fog that take people apart. Well, if you had that, you'd probably be able to put them back together, we figured. And so the bag is the flip side of that, is a liquid gel that does the reverse. It can put you back together, but where are those parts coming from becomes a sinister element in the story.
And then also whether you can psychologically accept them as part of yourself when you're fighting against, a fog.
Yeah, if your own body becomes a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy, it picks up some recursion errors along the way.
You had talked about, having Kuznetsov, like someone who, understands the larger picture. And I think one of the kind of great joys of this book is watching Millicent figure out like the thumb on the scale.
My favorite part too, Michael. It was so cool. And as soon as Ariel, I remember this moment where Ariel sent a letter back, and suddenly Millicent had gone from a character upon whom the world was acting to a character who now acts upon the world. And it just, that's when I knew that there was a story here. Like there's something happening. Like the world that we've created has forced someone to come alive, to come into themselves. It was so cool.
So that was just kind of happenstance, or like that like this came about, that it wasn't a active decision on both your parts, but that like Ariel kind of sussed out that Millicent should be an agent of change within this book.
Well, the great part about a book when you're collaborating, especially one that's made of letters, is you build the airplane at the same time that you're flying it. And so things seem like decisions that are keeping you aloft, but you're not consciously, at least we didn't consciously discuss them. One thing that did happen, though, is once we figured out that she would start to do something, Ariel and I collaborated to say, like, okay, if we have an artist on one side, a visual artist on one side, and we have a poet on the other, what is Millicent's art? And we decided that code writing, code breaking, puzzle making was an art, and that she had a language of her own, that her combination of those two things, the ability that a poet has to choose the right word and an artist has to choose the right image, she has this ability to do that inside of computer protocol systems. So a layman's way to say it is that she can write a poem or draw a picture inside of a computer and make it do what she wants it to do. And this makes her very valuable to a war effort in a future war, and very important to our story, that this is clearly something that the war effort is looking for, people who can do this, and she has to keep it secret.
That each of them are world builders in their own way, right? Whether it's through words, through pictures, or through code, but hers is the most impactful in the world within which you've built.
Yeah, it does. She has the most, I think sometimes when I reread the story recently, I realized that Millie at first seems in the story, at first blush, to be the one that has the most agency by the end. But upon reflection, I feel like she has the least agency. Her part that she will play is kind of a problem of this, therefore this. And once she begins her therefores, it becomes a chain that locks her into the inevitable ending of the book. And it really had a different ring to me when I read it recently, having forgotten, you have to kind of, in order to really enjoy a book you made, you have to forget writing it. So just recently I reread it again after some months and found this other layer in the story, which is interesting because I don't know where Ariel stopped and I began in writing those parts. And there were portions of the letters when we were doing the revisions where we would rewrite each other. And so there's this great magic where it's just a story now. And it's such a delight.
Well, you got a chance to read it. Others will now get a chance to read it as well. Blood Letters, out through Great Plains Publications. Gregory, thanks very much for joining me on the program and discussing the book.
Thanks so much, Michael. I appreciate it.